Thank you, Xavier. That's very kind. I'm Morgan Begg. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute of Public Affairs, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today my colleague, John Storey. John was, for more than 2 decades, a successful tax and commercial lawyer, rising to become a partner at Mills Oakley. Later, in his legal career, he left to found his own law firm. He's a keen student of history, politics and law, which is evidenced by the publication of his first book in 2021, Big Wars, Why Do They Happen and When Will the Next One Be? In 2022, John left a lucrative legal career out of a desire to confront the critical problems facing the country. Also in 2022, the IPA was looking for a senior, experienced legal mind to bolster its research team, especially as the change of government meant that the occurrence of a referendum was now a political certainty. And he's been so important in our work on that front. Since joining the IPA, John has become the director of our legal rights program, and it's been my pleasure to work with him on a day-to-day basis as he has produced important work, among other things, outlining the serious legal concerns of the voice, and especially as it relates to the precedent of the New Zealand Maori voice to Parliament, a topic which he will be speaking on today. Please join me in welcoming John Storey.
Thank you, Morgan. Everyone can hear me? It's good. The presentations on the voice so far have been very balanced and neutral, and I promise mine won't be. Have you ever asked yourself this question? Why is it that a radical climate change activist almost automatically becomes an activist in support of the voice? Why are radical socialists, radical feminists, or a supporter of radical queer and gender theory almost all ardent supporters of the voice? Why is it that if you go to any leftist protest on anything, climate change, a union rally, a gender inequality march, a trans rights parade, you will see an Aboriginal flag flying, right next to the Palestinian flag, and of course the ubiquitous pride flag? Why is that? In recent weeks, a lot of questions have begun to be asked about whether this referendum is about more than just the voice. There's been a lot of focus on the Uluru Statement from the Heart and whether it is 1 page or 26 pages, and what the Prime Minister really means when he says he'll implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. And Australians are right to be wary. Even the 1-page version of the Uluru Statement sets out a radical program, couched in the flowery language of voice, treaty and truth. A voice, a race-based advisory body enshrined in the Constitution. A treaty which would, at a minimum, involve some form of recognition of Aboriginal sovereignty and reparations for alleged past sins. And a Truth Commission, an Orwellian Department of Truth indoctrinating our kids into a certain view of Australia's colonial past. It's reasonable to ask, what next? Will we be saying farewell to our national flag and Australia Day? And don't forget, this government is the first government to create an assistant minister for a republic. If the voice gets up, you can bet that will be next. It cannot be emphasised how momentous these changes will be. In the span of a couple of parliamentary terms, we will have enshrined racial division and privilege into our Constitution, required some Australians to pay money to other Australians because of what their ancestors did, and removed the symbols of our national unity, our flag, Australia Day, and the stabilising effect of the monarchy. After such changes, would this even be the same country? A nation is more than just a geographical location. It is a system of government and the value systems of its citizens. An Australia that prioritises division, group identity and shame for its past is so different from one that seeks to promote unity, individual rights and love of our great country, the country I grew up in, that it might as well be a foreign land. Now, the Prime Minister would dismiss this as fear-mongering, of focusing on what the voice isn't about instead of focusing on what it is about. In his view, it is a modest request to recognise Indigenous people and listen to them. The problem the Prime Minister faces with this argument, an essential problem that the Yes case must overcome with the voice, is that it is not happening in a cultural vacuum. This debate is happening during a period of hyper-identity politics raging across the West, where Martin Luther King's dream of a society that judges people by the content of their character and not the colour of their skin has instead become a society in which theories like critical race theory, systemic racism, and diversity, equity and inclusion are the prevailing orthodoxies. Theories that argue race is an essential feature of individual identity, not an incidental one. A society where diversity and equity programs have infiltrated every major institution and business, and which require proactive measures to ensure ethnic minorities are proportionally represented. But at the same time, it is possible for academics to denounce whiteness as an incurable disease. A time when victimhood or blame is readily laid at the feet of people based on their skin colour or ancestry. However much we should judge the voice on its merits, it is difficult not to perceive it as part of the same agenda to racialise everything. And those who wish to reject the self-destructive path of identity politics we seem to be on, might in turn reject the voice as being part of that very same path. This debate is bigger than the voice. Indeed, it is bigger than voice, treaty and truth. It is a poll on what type of society we want to become. Let's return to the question. Why are leftist activists some of the biggest supporters of the voice? American author James Lindsay has used a biological analogy to describe ideologies. Just like animals can be divided into species, and some species grouped under a common genus, so for example, cats, panthers, leopards, tigers and so on, are all species of the feline genus, so ideologies can be similarly categorised. Lindsay claims that socialism, radical feminism, radical queer and gender theory, critical race theory and anti-colonialism are all species of a common genus, the genus of Marxism. What ties these ideologies together into a common genus? In essence, they are all anti-Western. In various ways, they all espouse the belief that Western values, liberty, democracy, meritocracy, capitalism, property rights, and respect for the nuclear family, actually represent the expressions of power of a privileged class used to oppress others. All that changes with each theory is how the oppressed and oppressor are defined. Bourgeoisie versus workers, male versus female, white versus person of colour, heterosexual versus queer, European versus Indigenous. In each case, Western values represent the values of the oppressor and so must be torn down. So what do Indigenous activists bring to this ideological genus? At its core, the arguments used by radical Indigenous activists challenge the legitimacy of Australia, a modern Western nation. Our parliament is not sovereign because sovereignty was never ceded. Thus, our institutions and laws are illegitimate. The land we live on is stolen land, which means our Western property rights are invalid. So if you think capitalism is destroying the planet, then an assault on private property is likely to appeal to you as well. If you think liberal democracy is actually patriarchal tyranny, then anything that undermines liberal democracy might have some appeal. Now, I am not saying that all people who support The Voice, or all Indigenous activists, are Marxists. All Australians want Indigenous people to have a better life, and many well-intentioned people think The Voice will help achieve that. But the path to hell is paved with good intentions. If, in the name of helping Indigenous people or redressing past wrongs, we encourage radical ideologies, this will greatly harm Australia, not least its Indigenous people. So how might The Voice foster radicalism? Well, let's have a look at some of the IPA's international research. We discovered a proposal to amend the Constitution of the United States. This proposal was made by a Mr. Ibram X. Kendi. You may have heard of him. He's become the face of critical race theory in the United States. He wrote a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. What is anti-racism? It is another term for racial equity, and racial equity is a rebadging of the term communism. Equity requires equality of outcomes, whether measured in terms of income, wealth, employment, university admissions, directorships of company boards, health statistics, incarceration rates. All social outcomes must be equal between racial groups. Mr. Kendi wrote in 2019, and I quote, "To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the US Constitution." What was he proposing? The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. So it'd be unconstitutional to have different outcomes between racial groups above a threshold or hold racist ideas. How would this be enforced? Kendi proposed enshrining in the US Constitution a Department of Anti-Racism. Now, I'm about to quote what powers Kendi proposed to give this agency, but instead of calling it the Department of Anti-Racism, I will rename it. I'll rename it The Voice. This is a quote other than the change of the name. "The Voice to Congress would be comprised of formally trained experts on racism. The Voice would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity. The Voice would monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. The Voice would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas." End quote. You can see why someone intent on tearing down the West might be attracted to such ideas. To ban racist ideas would severely curtail freedom of speech. To pre-clear all public policies would end democracy as we know it. To impose racial quotas for everything would be the end of meritocracy. Instead, jobs and opportunities must be allocated based on your racial characteristics, not your talent. Coleman Hughes, an African-American podcast host and critic of Kendi's, has written, "Make no mistake, if totalitarianism comes to the West, it won't be the fascism or communism of the 20th century, it will be the anti-racism of folks like Kendi." Is it fair to compare Kendi's proposal to The Voice? Might I be accused by the ABC fact-checkers of being alarmist? They do like to monitor me. The Voice certainly presents some challenges to traditional liberal democratic principles, such as equality of citizenship. However much the Prime Minister tries to downplay the powers of The Voice, whatever rights it does have will be protected by the Constitution and only be available to one group based on race and ancestry. But is it an overwrought analogy to compare it to Kendi's radical thought experiment? For The Voice to resemble a Department of Anti-Racism, it would need to meet three preconditions. First, The Voice will have to have a degree of binding political power. the ability to block public policies and punish wrongthink requires some degree of real power. Second, the voice will have to push an activist racial agenda, prioritising race over merit and emphasising equality of outcome over individual rights and liberties. And third, there must be a breakdown of ordinary democratic norms. That is the only way in which such an undemocratic institution could be tolerated. Let us examine all three preconditions in turn. First, will the voice be binding? The claim is that it will be an advisory body. Well, our research on New Zealand may be instructive in this regard. Why was the IPA looking at New Zealand? Because our Prime Minister has been. On February 6, 2020, Anthony Albanese posted the following message on Twitter, or X as it's now called. We can learn a lot from our mates across the ditch about reconciliation with First Nations people. New Zealand has led the way. It's time for Australia to follow. It's time to support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So the Prime Minister wants Australia to follow the New Zealand path. We thought we'd take a look where it leads. It led us to Casey Costello. Casey is a New Zealand woman with Maori heritage, a former police officer who now leads an organisation opposed to the racial policies being pushed in New Zealand. She's currently running for election to the New Zealand Parliament. There is an interview between me and Casey on the IPA website that I can recommend to you. In Casey's words, New Zealand is no longer a democracy, but an ethno-state. Race permeates all aspects of politics. Your race determines how you can vote, what say you get in politics, what role you can play in politics, what services you receive and what you must pay for them. New Zealand is a nation divided by race, two nations in one. It even has a name, co-governance. And it all started with an advisory body. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was set up to investigate Maori grievances about the Treaty of Waitangi and make recommendations to government. Sound familiar? In 1987, in a decision of New Zealand's highest court, it was held that the Treaty of Waitangi was binding on the government, and the court laid down various principles, called treaty principles, for how the treaty should be applied in the modern world. One of those principles was the right of redress. If Maori have a legitimate grievance, the government must offer redress of that grievance. But who decides what is a legitimate Maori grievance? The court held the Waitangi Tribunal had that power, and that its decision should be considered binding on the government. I'll quote from the decision. If the Waitangi Tribunal finds merit in a claim and recommends redress, the Crown should grant at least some form of redress, unless there are grounds justifying a reasonable treaty partner in withholding it, which would be only in very special circumstances, if ever. Let that sink in. In 12 years, the Waitangi Tribunal went from a purely advisory body to being a body that the government must listen to, except in very special circumstances. In other words, it's binding. How long before our voice follows the same path? It's true that things are different in New Zealand because they have the Treaty of Waitangi. Interpreting the spirit of that document is the primary source of nebulous ideas like a binding right of redress of grievance, even though the words of the treaty do not provide anything of the sort. But although Australia has no such treaty to draw upon, we have a different source of nebulous yet binding legal principles, the High Court of Australia and its interpretation of the Australian Constitution. High Court cases in recent decades suggest we'll go down the same path as New Zealand, and the voice will become much more powerful than the modest request some are contemplating. Here's a snapshot of what I mean. In the TO case, although international treaties aren't binding in Australia, unless enacted under domestic Australian law, the High Court said there is a legitimate expectation that they will be taken into account by government decision makers. Will the non-binding advice of the voice be treated the same way? It's not binding, but government decision makers must take their views into account. If a government decision maker is forced to consider the views of the voice, in practice, it will almost always get its way. Australia does not have a Bill of Rights or a right of freedom of speech like the First Amendment to the US Constitution. But the High Court has held there is an implied right of political communication. What implied rights might they grant to the voice? The voice will be able to make representations. Does that mean it has an implied constitutional right to a budget? How can you make representations without staff and premises to support your activities? Will the voice have the right to be consulted in advance? How can it make representations if it doesn't know in advance what laws or government decisions are being made? Will the voice have the right to be heard? What's the point of making representations if the government can simply ignore them? Will the voice have the right to launch investigations, such as calling witnesses to testify under oath, like the other two houses of Parliament? How can the voice make representations if it doesn't have all the information it needs? You can see that all sorts of rights and powers are possible despite what the words of the Constitution say. Australia's Constitution empowers Parliament to make electoral laws, but the High Court has felt free to override this when they don't like them. In the Roach case, they said prisoners serving sentences of less than 3 years can't be denied the vote. The proposed section 129, subsection 3 of the Constitution, this is in the new chapter being proposed, clearly states that Parliament's power to change laws in respect to the voice is subject to this Constitution. This gives the High Court a similar licence to override any laws about the voice that they don't like. But most concerning, the High Court has already shown a willingness to grant special rights to Australians who have descended from people who were living in Australia before European settlement compared to those that came later. In the Love and Tom's case, the High Court held that people who are not Australian citizens can only be deported if they don't have some Aboriginal ancestry, a special right by fluke of someone's family tree. So to recap, in recent decades, the High Court has made non-binding treaties in effect binding, read things into the Constitution that aren't actually written in the Constitution, overturned laws when they don't like them, and granted special privileges to Indigenous Australians. So yes, I think it's entirely plausible that the voice will obtain substantial binding legal power within our political system over time. The exact case, the exact legal argument, the exact circumstances, the exact time that brings it about can't be predicted right now. But if all the political forces and the institutional bias within the legal profession and the leanings of the High Court judges are tilting in that direction, it will eventually happen. The second precondition was, will the voice push an activist agenda? Let's return to the Waitangi Tribunal. Since being given quasi-binding power, it has never failed to push an activist agenda. Here's a summary of some cases. The tribunal has held that certain legislation directly affecting Maori land required Maori consent to amend or repeal that legislation. Because the consent of Maori was not obtained, it was a breach of the Treaty of Waitangi to proceed with the proposed amendments. The exercise of a veto, if you will. The tribunal has held that resources should be allocated on the basis of race. This included a finding that prioritising the allocation of COVID-19 vaccines on the basis of age, in which New Zealanders over the age of 65 received priority, was a breach of the treaty, despite age being the key COVID-19 health risk. This was because Maori was statistically younger on average than the average New Zealander, and so Maori would receive proportionately less of the first batches of the vaccine. Vaccines must be allocated on the basis of race. To hell with medical need or science. The tribunal has held that Maori should have a say in negotiating international trade agreements. Farmers, manufacturers, bankers, filmmakers, retailers, indeed any group interested in international trade agreements would no doubt like to have a say in how they are negotiated. But Maori have such a right, based only on their racial ancestry. The tribunal has held that Maori should have their own health system, which led to the creation of the Maori Health Authority. Maori can use either the Maori Health Authority or the national health system available to all New Zealanders, but the Maori Health Authority is just for Maori. Yet all New Zealand taxpayers are required to fund both systems. The tribunal has held that Maori should have a monopoly over the use of iconic cultural symbols, everything from the haka war dance to face tattoos to the kiwi bird. Such protection from cultural appropriation is not reciprocated with respect to Western art, music, fashion, language, or scientific or business methods. Western intellectual property laws allow for exclusive commercial exploitation of some works or processes for a finite term before they become part of the public domain, usable by anyone. But Maori cultural rights are unlimited and forever. Finally, the tribunal held that Maori incarceration rates must be reduced relative to non-Maori in accordance with, and I quote, fixed targets. The implications of this are clear. The race of a perpetrator must be taken into account in criminal sentencing. This is anti-racism in action, different laws for different races. I would assert that the Waitangi Tribunal today acts indistinguishably from Ibram X. Kendi's Department of Anti-Racism. It looks for any discrepancy in outcome between races and tries to stamp out racist ideas. Kendi would call it racial inequity or systemic racism or white supremacy. The tribunal calls it a breach of the Treaty of Waitangi. It all amounts to the same thing. Equality of outcome between races is the only acceptable outcome. The tribunal even tries to punish wrongdoers, as Kendi proposed. In the Maori incarceration rates case, the tribunal suggested that if Justice Department officials didn't meet their targets to reduce Maori incarceration, they must be, and I quote, held accountable. How Stalinist, punishing officials for not meeting their centrally planned targets. Australia's voice will be the same. The proposed model for implementing the voice, the so-called Karma Langton report, was designed by activists for activists. It will be a Canberra-based voice. Appointment to the voice won't necessarily be done by election, just by self-selection from the activist class, people who already have a loud voice in the community, some would say deafening. The report proposes strict gender quotas for membership of the voice and uses the term gender 81 times, and LGBTQI+, I hope I got them all, 12 times. Yet it only mentions disadvantage 8 times, and merit twice. The terms equity, diversity and inclusion are collectively used 203 times in the report. Want to have a guess how many times the word democracy was mentioned? None. The priorities of the authors of this report are clear. The race, gender and sexuality of members of the voice are considered crucial. How they will reduce disadvantage, how well they will perform and how fairly they will be chosen, less so. So we have 2 out of my 3 preconditions. The voice might become binding and will almost certainly push an activist agenda. What about the 3rd precondition, the undermining of democratic norms? I think we are seeing that with this very referendum debate. Firstly, there's been the tone of the debate. Anti-voice activists have been called everything from racists to rednecks to my favourite, eugenicists. For example, the government had proposed cancelling the traditional referendum pamphlet. Why? Well, to quote one government MP, it was because the government was not going to, and I quote, fund racism. Apparently nothing can be said, not a mere 2,000 words, opposed to the voice that would not be racist. Then there are the unfair financial arrangements. Anthony Albanese has said his government is providing the same funding to both sides, 0. This is completely false. It ignores the deductible gift recipient status granted to the Yes campaign last October. The government has only recently given DGR status to the No case. So the Yes case will have had the benefit of taxpayer subsidised support for their donors for a year prior to the referendum, while the No case gets it only a few months out. It ignores the years of public funding of pro-recognition organisations. Tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer funds, your money, have been given to Reconciliation Australia and its Recognise campaign, the Cape York Institute and other organisations who have been pushing constitutional recognition for years. There wouldn't be a Yes case today without years of government funding, and that includes funding from the Coalition. It ignores the $10 million government education campaign, Education. This is thinly veiled propaganda for the Yes case. It is a scourge of modern politics that governments of all persuasions are willing to spend taxpayers' money on feel-good propaganda campaigns that do more persuading than educating. But when there is a campaign as financially skewed as this one, it is particularly egregious. To the pro-voice government funding ledger should be added the $1 billion per year paid to fund our national broadcaster, the ABC. Their zeal for the voice can barely be contained, despite ABC management insisting their journalists undertake bias training to counter their pro-voice leanings. Then there's the internet censorship. The IPA produces dozens of videos a year promoting our research and has done so for years. But suddenly our research and the voice falls foul of terms of service on some pretense or other, meaning some of our videos can't be promoted. And of course, if you fall foul of the fact checkers, Facebook and Instagram will censor your views, as Peter Credlin found out when RMIT ABC Fact Check disagreed with her view that the Uluru Statement from the Heart was actually 26 pages long. The IPA and me personally has also fallen foul of the fact checkers, resulting in internet censorship. Let's be clear. These so-called fact checkers are partisan political activists. They are not neutral or independent. A casual glance at the matters they fact check reveals they almost exclusively target right-of-centre viewpoints, finding the most pedantic errors or no errors at all to be false misinformation, whilst wild claims by the left-of-centre politicians or commentators are rarely, if ever, challenged. As a simple illustration, the recently published referendum pamphlets were fact-checked by RMIT ABC Fact Check. Remarkably, of the 5 claims by the Yes campaign that were reviewed, they all got the tick of approval, whilst all 4 claims reviewed from the No pamphlet were problematic for some reason or other. Who could have guessed? But to make matters worse, the Australian Electoral Commission is apparently working with these same fact-checkers to tackle misinformation. This is outrageous. It would be like an AFL umpire asking the Collingwood cheer squad for help with their umpiring decisions. It is totally inappropriate for the agency that runs our elections and is meant to be neutral to team up with partisan journalists. Overall, this referendum campaign is extraordinary, almost unique in Western political history. The polls show the country is evenly split on the voice. Like most contended political debates in Australia, the result will be a close-run thing. But despite the public being 50-50, all the institutions of power in the country are in favour of the Yes campaign. And I mean all the institutions, the legal profession, much to my chagrin. Academia, much of the media, big tech, the sporting codes, the banks, most public companies, most faith groups, most not-for-profits, and of course the government itself, have all put their influence and dollars behind the Yes campaign. And those that speak out are denounced as racist. This is not a healthy state of affairs for a democracy. Whatever the merits of the voice, to have all the elite institutions opposed to the views of half, or probably more than half of the country, is not sustainable. Having the gatekeepers of political debate, social media platforms, journalists and academics, largely opposed to the views of half or more than half of the country risks undermining faith in democratic institutions. Changing the democratic rulebook, the Constitution, via a campaign so financially skewed towards one side risks feeding resentment and bitterness. In conclusion, if the powers of the voice increase over time, if the representations made by the voice are those of activists, and if the establishment of the voice was done via a fundamentally unfair process that undermines democratic norms, then inevitably the voice will be a vehicle for radicalism. Perhaps this is not the intention of the Prime Minister and other voice advocates. But if so, in an age of hyper-identity politics, it was naive in the extreme to propose implementing an act of reconciliation by granting rights permanently to a certain group on the basis of their identity characteristics, their race and Indigenous ancestry. The radical activist class, from the climate change movement to gender theorists, were always going to salivate at the idea of granting power to potential fellow travellers opposed to everything the West stands for. And this always risked turning off the majority, or at least polarising the debate. I, of course, can't know for sure how the voice will operate in practice, nor does any politician in Canberra. Because once the voice is in the Constitution, it can no longer be wholly controlled by voters or politicians. But I do know something. If the voice can only succeed through emotional blackmail, personal slurs, unfair funding and censorship, even if it succeeds at the referendum, it will not represent reconciliation. Perhaps it was never meant to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was terrific. So shall we, I'll open it up to questions immediately. Is perhaps John at the back is quick to put his hand up?
John Roscombe, thank you. John, if the voice was to succeed, from your research, how would it not be turned into something that you fear it might be?
I mean, the implementation of it is subject to Parliament. I think the best description is to say that the High Court will patrol the parameters of it, but the guts of it will be controlled by Parliament. I think the thing I would say about that is, I don't think, if the voice gets up, I don't think it's going to end democracy the next day. I can tell you when it's really going to hit the proverbial. It's when, if and when, the coalition is returned to government and the current government is in opposition and the activists who are downplaying the fears are now on the voice and the voice is opposed to the government on some contentious policy issue and the government is disagreeing with that advice. That's when we'll find out exactly what powers it has. That's when all the promises made by the Solicitor General and the Attorney General and Linda Burney, they'll be long forgotten. And that's when we'll find out, and it goes to the High Court. How to limit it? I mean, the thing is, if the coalition tried to effectively abolish it, there would be an outrage. So, I mean, once this train departs, I don't see there's any stopping it.
The gentleman on that table just there.
Can everyone hear me? Hi, I'm Callum from the Mancow Foundation. I was just wondering, could you please explain your proposition that the High Court of Australia could interpret the voice in a manner that causes it to become binding? Because I don't see it as analogous to the legitimate expectations notion in the case of TO, as in that the High Court found that any statutory or executive indications to the contrary can remove the presumption that administrative decision makers will make their decision in line with non-binding but ratified international treaties. So I was just wondering here, where all indications so far have been that the voice will be an advisory body that's non-binding, how could it possibly be analogous to a ratified treaty?
There's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't think certainly initially it will literally have a veto, but in my opinion that's just a matter of time before there'll be some decision such as, well, we've moved on and we have to accept it, the reality that, Indigenous people, in respect to certain legislation, their consent is needed. There's also some arguments under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People whether the voice consent would be required under that agreement. But there's more than one, as there's more than one way to skin a cat. I mean, if you can frustrate the process of government, and so that, you can go to court, you can slow down the process, you can have decision makers remake decisions. In an extreme, can the government get its way? Yeah, sure, at least initially, as I said. But the reality of that will be that the government will just go, it's not worth the fight. What do they want? How do we buy them off? There's more than one way to skin a cat. You can frustrate the process by slowing it down through court processes. There may be ways to challenge certain legislation on the basis that a certain process for consulting the voice was not properly followed. So I think that, as I said, it's not that day one it'll end democracy and it's going to have a veto over everything we say, but the starting point will be that it will be able to slow down and frustrate the process of government. And the important thing, and this is the important thing, and certainly when you look at something like the New Zealand experience, this stuff happened over decades. This is a permanent change. It's how it's going to be interpreted by the High Court in 50 years that I think an organisation like this would be concerned about. It's not what's going to happen day one, but how will this be interpreted in the future by activist judges.
Gentleman there.
Thanks very much, John. My name's Justin. I'm a senior associate at a firm in Sydney. And it struck me when you talked about the Venn diagram between subversive activists and voice activists, because at a recent awards night in Sydney, the keynote speaker was the inaugural Indigenous practitioner in residence at the University of Sydney Law School. And she made a very big point of the two key injustices which are problematic for Indigenous people in Australia. Those two issues were, one, the rule of law, and the second was the separation of powers, which we were all informed in the room are in fact the oppressive mechanisms of systemic racism and an oppressive white patriarchy in Australia. So my question is this: none of the other lawyers in the room batted an eyelid, and there would have been 200 there. If the voice is unsuccessful, how do we go about healing the rift when there are these lawyers, people who are promoted, who ultimately seek to subvert and tear down our fundamental protections in society?
Yeah, I think the day after campaign needs to be seriously considered. If we assume it's going to be a no, it's quite rare. It's not, referendums only come along quite rarely, at least in recent decades, for the people to get a direct say on a particular policy issue. Normally our elections are to vote for a government. There are all sorts of ScoMos or whatever, and I don't like what he did, and my local guy's a moron or whatever. So and you can always kick him out in 3 years' time. So it's not about specific issues. There might be some key policy issues that are part of the campaign, but it's not about a specific issue. This is about one specific issue. And as I said, if all the institutions, including ours, the legal profession, are saying this is the morally right thing to do, and it gets walloped in the election, that should be a wake-up call for those elite institutions, that they are the ones that are out of touch. They are the ones that are pushing something that the rest of us don't want. Now, I think, Tony Abbott said it brilliantly a couple of weeks ago at an IPA event, that he's voting no to the voice, but he's also voting no to the climate nonsense and the gender nonsense and all that. It really is, we don't want this. The normal, average Australian doesn't want this. Whether those elitist institutions, such as the one we work in, will change gear, I'm not sure lawyers are the most self-reflective. I expect the narrative from them will be, it's because people are too stupid. We need to double down on the misinformation laws. We need to, instead of indoctrinating them in primary school, let's start in kinder. So that's my concern, but that's also an opportunity for the right of centre to say, look, we've been browbeaten into doing the right thing on a whole range of issues that the people just do not support, and this is the wake-up call on that. So that's what I hope to achieve. Can I just add one more point on that? I do feel that the radical activists have snookered everyone brilliantly. I feel it's win-win for them. If the voice wins, they'll get this voice providing a representation, this plaything of the activists in our constitution. And if it loses, they get to denounce Australia as racist. It feeds their narrative. They'll be salivating at that as well. You can see someone like Lydia Thorpe, for example, although she said she's opposed to the voice, she can't wait until it's rejected, and she can denounce everyone as racist.
David Davis, Victorian State MP. There are many ways to skin a cat, as you said, and unlike New Zealand, we're a federation, and federal-state relations will be the first port of call for the voice. The voice, in my view, in answer over here, will look at every federal-state agreement. Where federal money flows, they will stick their nose in. Every education agreement, every health agreement, every transport agreement will become available for scrutiny, advice, points and leverage. Even to the Grants Commission, the voice will be down in the Grants Commission, kicking around, tweaking the funding formulas to the advantage, disadvantage, or whatever. So I'm a state MP, I'm interested in my state, but I do firmly believe, unlike New Zealand, which is a unitary system, there's a unique way for a voice in Australia to influence every area of Australian life. And we'll have this early intervention, following the money, giving the advice, and changing the nature of our federation forever.
It's certainly in New Zealand, this co-governance model, it is really the grassroots stuff. So it's things like water management. It's like the management of health services. It's all got to be equally managed. And by equal, I mean 15% of the population gets a half say, and the rest of the population gets a half say. So it's effectively unequal management. And of course, the non-Maori management of those organisations is effectively appointed or run by democratic processes. So it's Parliament appoints a minister, and a minister appoints his staff and whatever to manage it. They call it the Maori aristocracy. I mean, who's choosing these people? There's no democratic process. So it really is at that grassroots level where it happens there. The Karma Langton review called for representations to be made at all three levels of government, which is sort of confusing to me that that's the model. But I mean, the constitutional change only talks about representations and a body to advise Commonwealth government. So these local voices, and of course some states are implementing local voices, so I think it will be at multiple levels. And when they talk about, so I mean, I think you'll have your local council and there'll be an Indigenous representation, whether they have equal say in New Zealand or something else. I think it will, it will become, if it's not nipped in the bud now, it'll just spread. I mean, that's the other thing about New Zealand. After this case, these principles of the Waitangi Treaty were just put in every piece of legislation, and then every new body was had its Maori representation. It just percolated over the decades into this ubiquitous thing where it feels like two countries in one. But yeah, as I said, I mean, I don't think, certainly day one, I can doomsday future cases where the voice does become effectively, have some almost form of veto over at least some decisions. But I accept that's not going to be initially, but it's its ability to frustrate, to get involved. And the way politics works is that it might be better to say, we want to get this done over here. They're going to annoy us over that. What can we give them to keep them quiet?
Oh, thank you, John. Please join me in thanking John for his contribution.